This is a relay project.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jesperson.
Well, Real Talkers, we bring you this episode on the eve of a pretty big day. And I'm not just talking about those of you with, elementary school students in the house or pranksters in the workplace. Obviously, April Fool's Day, April 1st, one day from now. We're talking to you on March 31st. But if you've been paying attention to Canadian politics, if you've been paying attention to provincial, federal negotiations, conversations, that memorandum of understanding that Alberta's Premier, Danielle Smith, signed with Mark Carney months ago, you may remember that April 1st is a looming deadline to get an agreement, to get to a point where the provinces and Ottawa see eye to eye to move some of these major projects forward. April 1st, also a pretty significant day. If you've been watching the large emitters carbon tax, that industrial carbon tax that people talk about, it's about to bump up. And you may have noticed on social media, depending on who you follow or what your algorithm's feeding you, some folks decrying the raise, suggesting that there will be significant impacts in industry, including to consumers. Well, today we want to dig into these storylines and more, get a sense of what's really happening, what's realistic to happen over the next while, and what makes most sense for Canada moving forward. Andrew Leach will join us, an economist, in 30 seconds. And after that, we'll talk to business leaders, including the president of the Business Council of Alberta and the board chair of Cenovus Energy. We'll be taking a look at our Real Talk live stream presented by California Causes to see what you're adding into the live chat. And if you're listening to this later, like 95% of people will, we encourage you to send us an email to talk@ryanjesperson.com as this conversation continues. Let's reiterate. This is a mile marker of sorts. This is a check-in. This is an update. Nothing that you hear today, for the most part, will be a definitive truth forever because, as you know, the landscape can change. Public appetites can change. Demand can change. External factors like the United States and Iran and others can change. And, of course, this is a story that we'll keep an eye on moving forward. But this show's a big one to give us a sense of where Canada's at and where Canada's going. That coming right up. This episode is happening with the presenting sponsorship of RapidX Financial. If you're into crypto or you've been keeping an eye on Bitcoin, I don't have to tell you that it moves fast, and it's obvious that your trust in an exchange absolutely cannot be a gamble. And that's why Real Talk is proud to partner with RapidX Financial. This is a made-in-Alberta solution that's backed by the same experts behind those Rapid Cash ATMs that you've seen for 25 years or so across the country. RapidX makes it easy for you to get started with 3 ways to trade. They've got the physical crypto ATMs, easy to use. If you're like me and you could use a little human counsel, or you're making a discrete larger value trade, they do have the over-the-counter desk and, of course, the secure online platform that we show you here at rapidxfinancial.com. If you're going to be using the online platform, rapidxfinancial.com, make sure you mark the promo code Ryan50. That's Ryan50. That'll take 50% off all fees for your online Interac e-transfer trades. Now, you may have questions around RapidX Financial, and we encourage you to do your research. You'll find that it's secure, it's FinTrack registered, and critically, it's non-custodial, meaning you're always going to control your keys. That's promo code Ryan50, Ryan50 at rapidxfinancial.com. Well, we've checked in from time to time when we need to really understand something, when we need to really get a sense of the real-life impact of economic policy or industry developments. Dr. Andrew Leach has been the guy. And today, joining us in our Real Talk studio in the historic Mercer Warehouse in downtown Edmonton, here he is in the flesh, energy and environmental economist, Dr. Andrew Leach. This is our first in-person interview, quite some time.
First in-person interview. Nice to be in.
Very good to have you here.
In this space. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thanks for making time for us. You've always kind of been our go-to when we want to make sense of things. You have an ability to not just understand them, that's your job, but to help regular folks like us understand them as well. So
I'll try. I like that intro.
yeah, well, I'm just trying to like heap up pressure on you.
Johnny will
Make it-
capture it. I can just post it on my website.
Yeah, that would be exactly perfect. Energy and environmental economist. What does an environmental economist do?
Track the impact of environmental policies. Think about how most cost effectively or at lowest cost to everybody you can reduce, whether it's pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. Think about how we make trade-offs between people's well-being and industrial activity, all of those questions.
And I guess that's what the mandate of the carbon, or at least the justification of the carbon tax has been. But before we get into this, and I'm going to have some entry-level questions for you too. It's pretty important to differentiate, isn't it? Like we see a lot of noise around the carbon tax, maybe less now than there was a couple of years ago. Now that Mark Carney stole Pierre Poilievre's idea and axed the tax. That was the consumer carbon tax that was axed.
Yeah.
And maybe some folks have noticed a difference in what their bills look like or what their bottom line looks like. But then you've also got the industrial carbon tax. That remains. Not only does it remain, it bumps up coming up in 24 hours or so on April 1st.
Yeah, so we have a federal carbon pricing law, and that federal carbon pricing law applies only in provinces that are deemed not to have a sufficient policy in their own right. So for example, it doesn't apply in Alberta. Alberta's provincial policy applies here and has always applied here on the industrial side. There was a federal consumer price in Alberta, but the industrial price has always been ours. Ontario has its own, Quebec has its own. So the federal price directly only applies in Manitoba, PEI, and the territories. So the rest of it is driven by provincial policies, and those, depending on which province you're in, may or may not step up on April 1st. There's no material change in Quebec. Alberta's already said it's freezing its carbon price. We'll see what happens with that memorandum of understanding. But the share of emissions in this country that get touched by that change tomorrow is going to be really small.
Oh, go on.
So, it's only going to be in those couple of provinces where there aren't very many large industrial emitters. In Manitoba, for example, I think 2 of the 5 largest are landfills. So you think about how long that takes. That's not your consumer in your hand at the gas pump or whatever. Wow, now garbage disposal is slightly more expensive. That takes a while to filter through, and it's a small share of the overall costs of operating those facilities. So you're just not going to see a big change anywhere in the country tomorrow, as compared to what we used to see on the day that the consumer carbon price would go up. You could, go and see at the gas pump, and it would bump up that next day. It's appearing directly on your receipt. So that's not what's happening tomorrow.
What's been your assessment or your take on the impact of canceling the consumer carbon tax? What have you seen? What do the numbers show?
Well, I think the numbers are pretty direct, right? So let's take diesel fuel, for example. So diesel fuel before the zero rating, that's a 21 cent a liter diesel fuel charge. That went to zero. And it went to zero immediately everywhere in the country except BC and Quebec. BC then followed quite quickly by removing its own consumer carbon pricing regime. Quebec has its own carbon pricing policy that's separate from the federal one, so it still applies there. But that's a direct drop at the pump. Now, people will look and say, today, I'm paying more than I've paid in years at the gas pump. That's true, but that's because of the underlying oil price. It's not because there's some, the industrial carbon price does not apply directly at the pump. It didn't replace the consumer carbon price. None of that is that sort of being batted around in different circles. None of that's true.
What sort of an impact have you seen as the the large emitter carbon price has raised in past years? Is it actually advancing Canada closer toward climate goals?
Yeah, I think the biggest place that you see it, and again, this is Alberta's policy, but it was Alberta's policy that followed the federal price schedule. We see it here in the coal phase out, right? That was the big change. Premier Notley, taking the advice from a panel that I chaired, changed the design a little bit from what Premier Stelmach had introduced. That made it such that, if you were a higher emitter, you paid more. And coal power, for example, is much higher emissions, in some cases more than double natural gas power. So that's what really drove the coal phase out in Alberta, was that change from a carbon price that treated coal a little bit more generously than it treated gas to one that treated everybody the same. It drove the renewables boom that we saw here in Alberta by putting the opportunity to earn carbon credits into the economics of those projects. And so all of that's probably the most visible for people here in Alberta. Across the country, that effect's going to vary. And, provincial carbon prices have varied a little bit in how they've approached their specific design. Saskatchewan's always the fun question in Canada. They eliminated their industrial carbon price more than a couple of years ago, I think now. And the federal government has not acted to impose the federal price in Saskatchewan. So in Saskatchewan, there's no industrial carbon pricing. And, you'd sort of wonder when we're having all of these discussions about what will Mark Carney and Danielle Smith agree on this week. So I wonder what's going to happen in Saskatchewan. Why do they carry on with zero while we're having this? What will the federal government sort of force to happen in Alberta?
Yeah, what's your speculation, or what does your gut tell you about the Saskatchewan situation?
I mean, my gut is that the federal government has maybe missed a window to react, both to Saskatchewan and to some degree to Quebec having a lower carbon price than the federal benchmark price. And so now you're in this world where they would like probably to have a stronger industrial carbon pricing signal in Alberta. But how do you do that? How do you do that when for a couple of years you've let Saskatchewan have zero? From essentially the outset, you've allowed Quebec to have a price that's lower than everybody else. Turn around and say, well, yeah, but this is Alberta. They got more emissions, so we want to do something different. I don't know that's what a federal carbon pricing regime should look like. Treat everybody the same.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, that was the rationale early on, was all emissions are the same. So that's why I want consumer carbon price, industrial carbon price. Don't treat the oil sands differently. Now, thanks in part to Mr. Poilievre, we've gone back to a policy that says industrial emissions should be our focus. Do you know where over half of industrial emissions in Canada are in Alberta? So imagine if a federal government had come out and said we should focus on Alberta emissions more than the rest of the country, we would have, we wouldn't have been pleased with that, but that's where we've ended up. But now we're also saying, Alberta has a carbon price, we're frozen at $95 a ton right now, but other provinces have zeros, 30s, et cetera. We're in a little bit of a treatment that isn't quite even at this point.
I want to drill into the thanks in part to Mr. Poilievre and what you mean by that. How did he influence that trend or that conversation anyway?
Well, I think just by removing the consumer carbon price. And so if you look across the country, emissions from cars, trucks, buildings, houses, et cetera, if you're in Quebec or in Ontario, it's those transportation emissions that are the largest share of your emissions. In Alberta, it's industrial emissions that are the largest share of ours. And what got driven as a policy change was remove the price on transportation emissions, keep the price on oil sands, which wouldn't necessarily be a type of policy that I had Prime Minister Trudeau come out and said, listen, we're going to have a policy that says consumers get their emissions for free and Alberta industrial emitters have to pay. That would have been a very unpopular policy. But that's kind of where we've ended up. Industrial carbon price, yes. Rest of emissions, no. And, as an economist, you asked earlier what we do. We think about how much we're spending on reducing emissions. And if you let all of those potential emissions from consumers go without a carbon price and you rely on just seeking reductions from industrial emitters, you're going to end up with a more expensive policy.
Well, and the justification, in talking to former Prime Minister Trudeau about it, was always that it was intended to change behavior. At least that was the premise of it,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
I mean, did we see evidence that was happening? And in that sense, if you're, I think most people to a certain degree would be environmentalists and that you care about the air you breathe and the water that you drink and the world that you leave for those behind you. Did we see evidence it was working, and have we then taken a step back?
I mean, we've seen evidence that it's working, but you shouldn't expect, the overall change, I was talking about 20 cents a liter, in the context of all of the other changes that were going on. So oil got a lot cheaper over much of that period. We ended up, we went from environments of triple-digit oil prices down to, oil prices in the 60s, 50s. So our gas prices, which is what consumers actually respond to, they don't say that much, they don't react that much differently, a little bit differently to a carbon price versus a gas price change. And over the time that the carbon price was increasing, the underlying gas prices were generally not increasing at the same rate. And so it was a relatively small change in the total value. You're not expecting people to, leave their F-150s in the ditch because they can't afford to drive them anymore over, 20 cents a liter. You're expecting people that the next time they buy a car, maybe they take a longer look at a hybrid. The next time they buy a car, maybe they take a longer look at an EV. Maybe that decision of which car to take. Do I take my smaller vehicle or to take my truck when I'm going to the mountains or into the city? Those types of decisions. And you see evidence of that, but the price it's not to say that it wasn't high. It does impact people, but you wouldn't expect those type of radical decisions where I can look and see, my neighbor, I can tell exactly what they did. It's those subtle changes in behavior across the whole country that you're looking for.
Several Alberta premiers have argued that the Alberta advantage includes, the lowest corporate taxes in the country, and that there's always been a tax advantage to bringing business to Alberta, to keeping business in Alberta. When we look at a bump up in the large emitters or the industrial carbon tax, what's the sense that you get about the impact that might have in business confidence or investment retention, or that whole file?
Well, remember, it's not changing in Alberta. So for the point of view of Alberta businesses, nothing changes on industrial carbon pricing.
You're either in Canada or you're gone?
It's just you're covered by the Alberta policy.
Yeah.
So there's no price increase tomorrow. We'll see what happens with the memorandum of understanding over time. But for now, there's no price change in the Alberta policy tomorrow. So if you're operating an industrial emitter in Alberta, your world doesn't change tomorrow. You're still reporting emissions to the province. You're still paying $95 a ton if you don't have enough credits.
It was just the provinces you mentioned earlier. That's it.
Yeah, it's that. And the thing about the industrial carbon price is it's not just pay tax on emissions. You also have, they call it an output-based pricing system, or I would have called it output-based allocation of credits, where you get some of your emissions for free. And for many operations, that might be more than their total emissions. So remember a couple of weeks ago, there was a big outcry about CNRL said, we're not going to do the Jack Pine mine expansion. And they talked about industrial carbon pricing. Go and look at that particular project, the existing Jack Pine mine. It makes money on industrial carbon pricing because they're really low emissions oil production. They have a lot of combined heat and power that they generate emissions credits. So they actually, if you look back at the Alberta government data on that project, they've actually generated more credits than they've needed. So they're a net seller of carbon credits. Renewable power, net seller of carbon credits. Something like carbon capture, so the new hydrogen plants that we're looking at, they'll be large net sellers of credits. So it's not just that there's a buy side, that there's people who are paying more. There's also a lot of industries, and increasing more and more every day, that depend on the revenue from the industrial carbon pricing program. They're on the emissions reduction side.
How would you assess how it was interesting, we had a chance to sit down with Prime Minister Carney relatively recently after some of so you got the MOU, got a bunch of things changing, and of course there was an interesting development, and there hasn't been a ton of reporting around it, and I wouldn't say that it's been driving headlines, but the Environmental Caucus within those Liberal MPs within the Greater Liberal Caucus had pushed back, and there have been rumblings that, and not just with elected members, but also with Liberal Party supporters, that many people feel like the party's swinging too far right or too far sort of away from environmental commitments, or this kind of steadfastness that the party had around that. What's your assessment of how the Prime Minister has, and if we can even just zoom out on how he's managed the entire file? We talk about the intersection, which is your wheelhouse, between the environment and the economy.
Yeah, I think, you see that in the federal Liberals. You also see it almost on the other side with the provincial Conservatives here, that there are some who just scrap the whole thing and why are we bothering cutting emissions, et cetera. And so I think that MOU is super interesting because somehow the Prime Minister and the Premier have to keep both of their teams on side for the whole thing. And so I think they both have somewhat different challenges there in terms of the people who want different levels of action on climate change. I think, the PM so far, he's made the decisions that were politically necessary. The cut in the consumer carbon price, it wasn't a decision that I would have supported, but by the time we got there, I don't think there was another political option for him.
Why? You just think that the tax messaging was so effective?
It just became the thing that was blamed for everything. You'd had that long period of post-COVID, Ukraine war, inflation, and everything was being blamed on the carbon tax. And so I think it had just become a toxic policy. And for quite some even when it was introduced, we knew generally that, if you ask consumers, what would you rather have? Would you rather have a price on carbon, or would you rather have the government pay for, new insulation and new furnaces and all that thing? Consumers will always say, I'd rather have the policy where the government pays me to do stuff. And they don't think about how that gets paid for, right? They don't think of that as being deficits or taxes that have to pay for those changes. And so, the Economist recommendation was always put a price on carbon, let consumers figure out where the low cost emissions reductions are, where they let businesses don't tell businesses through regulation how to reduce emissions. Let them figure it out. They're much better at it than governments. But, that was a political necessity. But I think now, the Prime Minister's caught with this question of, can I get a pipeline to the Northwest Coast? He hasn't explicitly promised one, but he's come pretty close. He's promised acceleration of major project approvals. That's going to start, we're going to start being, we're now a year plus into his time as Prime Minister. People are going to start to say louder and louder, where are those approvals? And so I think that's going to be a challenge for him. And then this MOU, to land it, when you look at that document, say what's in there? Carbon pricing, pathways, so multi-billion-dollar carbon capture and storage project. One project, one review. That's easy. It's already done. New methane regulations, standing down of the clean electricity regulations in Alberta, which will probably lead to them standing down in other provinces as well. And a lot of other major changes. It's a pretty dense document. And so there's a lot of that stuff to land that I think, when you bring that together with, okay, now what does this mean for Canada's emissions trajectory? What does this mean for Canada's targets? I think he's going to have to say we're no longer on track to meet our targets. And maybe that doesn't matter as much to Canadians as it did 10 years ago. But that's for him to kind of figure out, sort out.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to know where the audience lands on that. We'll look to our live chat here, powered by Park Power. Dr. Andrew Leach, our guest in our feature interview, presented by Mercedes-Benz Edmonton West. By the way, you see this green square right here? That's Super Chat Ken. He's just kicked in $5 to the show. That's how audience members can buy you a cold beer. So when you're walking out, you can hit the beer fridge. He says, I always love gaining knowledge from Andrew Leach. Says his depth of knowledge on the subject matter is nothing but impressive. So there you go, a little bouquet for you. The Premier has told...
It's a little early for a beer, but we are above an Irish pub, so I guess you do what you have to do.
Yeah, you don't have to drink it now, or you can hang out with us in the green room. But the Premier has said that, for all intents and purposes, and you said the same thing when you walked in and we're getting a coffee, you said that April 1st, with regards to this MOU and these deadlines for these major projects, obviously not expecting major announcements, tomorrow or this week. She said that she believes that they will miss the early deadlines in an interview from Texas, and a big part of that conversation is the new pipeline. Yeah. Your thoughts on I guess when you talk about new pipelines, you can talk about all kinds of things, including social license, whether or not investors will be keen on this, assuming that not everybody wants the government to foot the tab. And then there's always the question around justification. Like, are we at capacity? Is there demand for a new pipeline? Does it make financial sense? What's your take on it?
So there's a lot in there. I think landing a pipeline, especially a pipeline to the Northwest Coast, is going to be really challenging. And, the soundbite I always use to explain this to people is, remember Jason Kenney, right? When he was running for Premier here, he had on his podium jobs, economy, pipelines. Yes. That was his major focus. Do you know what his first statement to the media was after the Harper government approved the Northern Gateway pipeline? So they approved it, and he was the first minister in that cabinet to speak to the media after the approval was announced. And his quote at that point was to Tom Clark on Global News, and he said, no individual project is a national priority. Because it was so politically divisive, even in their caucus. Getting a pipeline to the Northwest Coast is going to be challenging with respect to First Nations. It's going to be challenging with respect to landowners. It's going to be challenging in the communities that are going to be affected by it. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be harder than Trans Mountain. That's part of why Trans Mountain went ahead. So I think that's a major challenge for the Carney government to think about what that pipeline looks like. It's a major challenge for Premier Smith to deliver a project proposal by July 1st, which is what she's promised, to deliver a proposal that not only meets, creates the opportunity for the Prime Minister to say yes to it, but it, allows maybe some buy-in from those local communities to figure out what it is that's going to make this project look interesting to a broader swath of Canadians. I'd like to see it happen. I think when we look at prior to TMX, our largest oil export port was Houston. And that's a really bad position for us to be in, that we're sending our oil through the U.S. for re-export to India. We should have our own export ports that we control. If we're going to export crude, let's do so, and let's do it through our own export ports. We're going to allow the opportunity for some growth. There's some ability to expand some existing pipelines, but again, the fastest route to Asia, the shortest pipeline route to port is going to be to BC. So I hope that Premier Smith and Prime Minister Carney can make something happen that gets us more capacity off the West Coast.
And probably like just drive Premier Eby crazy to hear you say that. You kind of get the sense, and he indicated as much when Premier Smith and the Prime Minister signed that MOU months ago, that he was, I mean, in my words, he was pissed off that he wasn't consulted. And you kind of get the sense that he feels like BC and maybe his government is not a big enough player in these conversations.
Yeah, and I mean, we do have historically this being federal jurisdiction, strongly protected federal jurisdiction for exactly this reason. We don't want, historically in Canada, one province holding other provinces hostage on economic trade. And so I think there is some federal capacity to get through, but there's also BC politics, and there's a Liberal government that has a strong presence in BC. And so I think the Prime Minister, it's really going to fall on the Prime Minister, not necessarily to bring Premier Eby on side as much as to bring the people of BC on side, to make it clear that this is he's coined the term project of national interest, or we'll use the acronym PONY. I keep trying to push people to adopt that. He's convinced people that we need this new approach. We have projects of national interest. We need to get them built. Okay. Build a political consensus in BC to get it built.
Cliff in our chat, powered by Park Power, your friendly local utilities provider at parkpower.ca, says when the hoops we're talking about have already been declared null or inhibitive by the feds with interprovincial pipelines bill C-69, it creates an environment where it's tough. As mentioned, we're going to be talking to a couple of industry voices, Adam Legge from the Business Council of Alberta, and we'll talk to Alex Pourbaix as well, as the board chair at Cenovus Energy. They've got a brand new report out right now. Basically, I mean, I'll give them a chance to clarify, but they're kind of like under the current structure, under the current regulatory process, $1 trillion of investment will not be unlocked. They're saying that there's a need for urgent and sweeping reform, and they'll explain that in about 10 minutes' time. But your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we do need, and Prime Minister Carney's already brought this in, that idea that we have the political decision up front, that it's not wait 10 years and then surprise a government's opposed to it. But the one time that's actually happened over a pipeline, where a government has said, after a pipeline made it all the way through the process, and a government has said no, that was under Harper-era legislation. That wasn't a C-69 problem. That was legislation that the Harper government brought in 2012 to make it such that we would have accelerated approvals. We've had 4 or 5 different pipeline regimes, 3 or 4 different pipeline regimes in the last little while, if you count C5 as one. That's not the problem. Really isn't the legislation. The problem is, as I said prior, can you build the political consensus? So you go back and you say, why is it that Gateway disappeared from the radar? Why was it that it took, during the entire time of the Harper government, Enbridge started working on that project officially in 2004. Justin Trudeau comes into office more than 10 years later, and that pipeline has not moved forward. Right? Those are the questions that we should be asking, is not, what's changed today? It's, we've had this series of, whether you have very supportive politicians or very unsupportive politicians or whatever, the outcomes not necessarily run with that. Justin Trudeau got a pipeline to the West Coast built. Prime Minister Harper couldn't get one off the ground. And so, I think we're focused too much on the words of the legislation and not enough on what is underlying. Can we build a national consensus around the federal government saying yes to some of this infrastructure?
We're going to throw 2 big files in front of you. Maybe there's lines you can draw between them, maybe not. But I'm hearing a lot of people talk about Energy East, either citing it as an example or musing about whether or not that could be kickstarted. And then, of course, people are talking about Keystone XL as well.
Yeah, I mean, Keystone XL as a project, when it was proposed, was the gold standard. You've got an easy route across easy to build on territory to the largest refinery complex in the world. That sounds great. Now we have a Trump presidency in the U.S., some big political uncertainty in the U.S. I think a Northwest Coast pipeline probably moves above Keystone XL just for that reason, just so that it's pipeline on our territory that we control. Energy East, it would be if you wanted to build a pipeline in North America and find the longest way to a port, I'm pretty sure Edmonton to St. John is essentially that, right? Pipeline transport is expensive relative to tanker transport. So the longer you move it on land, the more expensive your barrels become. So when you talk about Energy East, it's, would we rather, think of getting in your car and saying, I want to find my way to salt water. Where are you going? You're going to BC. You're not driving to St. John. Much as I love New Brunswick and such, it's a long, long drive. And the same thing's true of moving oil in a pipeline. It's a long way. That makes it more expensive. We have heavy oil that the refineries in Quebec City and Montreal, or Quebec City and St. John, are not really equipped to handle. So it's a long route that doesn't really solve our problem. If we can build up political consensus west, I think that's just a way better project for all purposes.
I was telling you how much I enjoy following you on social media, so I know that you are equipped to handle this. You're an economist that can get outside the numbers as well. This is maybe more of a sociology or political science question, but of course you have to talk about whether or not attitudes are actually changing in BC. The social license idea, and maybe the impact that the American administration, the Trump administration, or maybe even like the war in Iran would have on people's attitudes around Canada's energy sovereignty, economic independence, and the like. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen opinions change. I can't remember if it was David Coleto's polling that did attitudes towards pipelines all the way across the country. And I think you see that a little bit from the Prime Minister as well. This idea that, let's not make the decision about what we're going to do in terms of our economic activity through infrastructure. So let's decide whether we're producing oil, we're exporting oil. If we're doing it, let's do it in a way that maximizes the value of that shortest, cheapest route to market. And I think you're starting to see Canadians come around to that having a proxy fight over a pipeline when it's really about, are we developing oil and gas, et cetera, I think people are not as keen on that particular fight over the pipeline versus the broader policies around that development.
Kind of an interesting headline today down in the United States. I think it's for the first time in quite some time, gasoline is averaging over $4 a gallon, which is, for a lot of people, that's the factor that's the canary in the coal mine for politicians. That's, it's a big deal. The price of gas at the pumps. It's something that everybody can relate to. Your thoughts on that and its translation to Canada and its relevance to everything we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're back to affordability questions for sure on gas. I mean, the big thing when we're talking about oil, whether it's oil sands development or pipelines, these aren't bets on today's oil price, right? They're bets on the oil price from, if we're talking about building a new project today, it's what's the oil price from 2030 to 2055. And we hope that the situation in the Middle East has resolved itself in the next 6 months, not 4 or 5 years. And so then the question is, are we back to fundamentals where the world is producing more oil more cheaply than we would have ever expected? If we're back in that world, that makes it more challenging to build new oil sands projects. It's more challenging for pipelines. And one of the things I think the industry does need to do a better job of, right? When you think of how the industry talks about Canadian oil and gas, on the one hand, they say, it's the economic engine. On the other hand, they're very quick to say, if you look at it the wrong way, it might all blow up in your face and go away. Everyone might flee. And so when you're trying to make the case to Canadians, I think we need to do more to say, this is actually a profitable industry. It's an industry that is stable, viable. It's not going to go away tomorrow. It's not going to leave a large environmental liability on the landscape if you sneeze at it in the wrong way. And so I hope maybe we'll see what Mr. Pourbaix has to say on this. But I think making that case to Canadians that this isn't something that could go away tomorrow is really important. That you need Canadians to buy into that 20 to 30 year bet. And not have them thinking that, this is a marginally profitable industry that might just flee south of the border if the wrong, small change in policy happens.
I'm not suggesting that Canada's major oil and gas players have relied on this argument, but backers of it, Ezra Levant and others, you knew I was going there, but the argument around ethical oil, and people have said that, you can be proud of Canada's human rights record for the most part, and if you take a look at some of the other oil producing nations, Canada far exceeds them when it comes to how we treat our fellow human beings and our environmental convictions and our sense of responsibility. You know the idea.
Yeah,
I don't need to make the argument to you, but that's not what you're talking about here. You're not arguing for that approach at all.
No, not at all. I'm saying, in the same way as, you think of a mill town, and what they're really going to be concerned about is that mill going to stay in business, right? Is that going to be there for the next generation? And the messaging generally that we hear, and I think that a lot of Canadians hear about our oil and gas industry, is not that this is, an incredibly profitable industry where people can build their careers. They think of it as being something that's very precarious. And I think in many cases, when industry advocates are lobbying against government policy, things like the industrial carbon price, you say, wow, this is something that, if you change the industrial carbon price, all of this could go away, right? They're basically saying that this is 15, 25, 30 cents a barrel away from not being profitable. And that's just wrong. And so, I think they shouldn't be quite as afraid to tell Canadians that this is an industry, that these projects that exist right now are very profitable, that they're viable at prices, that oil prices that we've been seeing lately, and to let, give politicians a little bit of that ammunition, as opposed to just all the rigs are going to flee south of the border, that old kind of discourse that we've had for decades.
Anecdotally, I'm seeing a lot of suggestion that with the increase on April 1st of the industrial carbon, the large emitters carbon tax, that Canada loses its competitiveness and stacked against the United States.
Imagine if go back to the Ezra Levant arguments, but if this were, liberals or other, like the Green Party, telling you how emissions intensive our whole supply chain is. Like, to get some of the numbers that people are using about the industrial carbon tax, you'd have to imagine that, we're essentially running coal-powered tractors and that we're transporting every single individual strawberry to market in a coal-powered train, right? That's the type of impact you'd need to get the types of inflationary storylines from the carbon tax and that people are attributing to it. Same thing on the oil sands side, right? This is 15 cents. In some cases, it's a policy that oil sands producers are making money on, but even at the high end, it's like $1 a barrel in average cost. And then, so are we really that close to people don't want to produce this oil? And that's where I'm saying, pick a lane. Right? Tell Canadians a story. You only get to pick one. Is it we're $1 a barrel away from everybody abandoning this thing, or 15 cents a barrel away from it? Or this is something that you should be prepared, if the government needs to put money behind a pipeline, then they should be prepared to do it because of the long-term bet. If the government needs to put money behind pathways, they should want to do it because here's the sort of long-term viability of that industry. You don't get that if you're also telling Canadians that, if you change that cost structure by a couple pennies, this whole thing could go away. And that's where I'd rather see us be coherent about the economic bet that's there.
The Pathways project that would capture, and I'll recognize we're going into overtime, and we got another panel here standing by, so I'll get to them in a second. But we've talked about it on the show quite a bit, and the idea that it would capture emissions from 20 oil sands facilities and move them about 400 kilometers away by pipeline to a terminal near Cold Lake where they'd be stored underground. It'd be built in phases from a couple of years from now through till 2040. But the companies behind the project haven't made a final investment decision on it. What's your prognostication?
Well, the only reason you're investing in carbon capture and sequestration, the only reasons are, number one, you think you have to do it in order to, so that social license story.
Yeah.
Or I'm getting carbon credits that are worth enough to make it worthwhile. And if we're pushing down the industrial carbon price and we're saying, there's no more regulations, no more emissions caps, no more kind of social license angle, why would the companies do it? So then you push more towards it's only going to happen if governments pay the lion's share of it. And Mr. Pourbaix, that you've got coming on, has talked about this. I remember a podcast he did with Kathleen Petty on West of Centre, where he talked about, this is really going to be something. It's hard for him to make the case to his shareholders. And I think he's right about that. Come into a room of oil sands shareholders and say, what I want you to do is spend $1 billion of your money, your capital, on building essentially a carbon credit generating machine, when you have at least the other major party in Canada saying we'll make those credits worth nothing if we get elected. And you have uncertainty about how much they're worth under a Carney government. Would you make that? Would you make that investment? And I think that's the challenge, and Mr. Pourbaix is going to be better placed than me to talk about that. But it's a really challenging pitch to make to an oil sands company shareholder.
Yeah, we'll ask him about that in just a moment. Appreciate Gridlock EMV for the Super Chat contribution. Thanks. Wants me to ask you, what if the twinning of TMX isn't that satisfactory to Alberta?
Potentially, but the challenge there is the Port of Vancouver. right? You've got a pretty constrained port. You can't load the largest of the oil tankers in there. Even with dredging, we're going to have challenges getting anything larger than what's called an Aframax tanker in there. And so that just makes your overall shipping logistics to Asia more expensive. I think if you're picking a port on the West Coast, port-wise, you want to go to Prince Rupert. Challenge with Prince Rupert is it's hard to get a pipeline there. Enbridge looked at it with Northern Gateway, and they said, we can't build a safe pipeline to Prince Rupert. They went to Kitimat, which, again, still a better deepwater port than Vancouver. So Premier said she's got 5 ports in mind. I'd like to know what the third, fourth, and fifth ones are there that she thinks are viable. But to me, if you can avoid the port of Vancouver, you're better off.
A follow-up from Gridlock on a working proposal to Churchill. Oh, the great tragedy is the podcast listeners won't see the look on your face.
It's a 4-month shipping season, right? What we need, when you think about, when we talk about oil production, we're talking about, hundreds of thousands of barrels per day that we want to move. If you say, now you've only got a 4-month shipping season. Heather Exner-Perot had a great line on this on Jackie Forrest and Peter Terzakian's podcast. She said, there's a reason why the Alaskan crude runs through a pipeline south over land for like 1,000 kilometers, because they didn't want to use icebreakers. So why would we, instead of going to Vancouver or instead of going to Prince Rupert or wherever, why would we go to somewhere with a 4-month shipping season, need for icebreakers, massive transportation costs? Don't get it.
I'm going to ask my final question to you as vague and as broadly phrased as possible. So answer it however you like. What's one impact of Avi Lewis's NDP leadership win that you'll be keeping an eye on?
I think that question of how do you stand up to that prairie heritage and that, Tommy Douglas, Rachel Notley type of strength of a prairie NDP, right? Even when we think about someone like an Ed Stelmach, that, is maybe bends a little bit left of the current Conservative. How do you connect to that voter if you're not really talking about the activities that run our economies here in the same way you talk about auto manufacturing or pulp and paper, what have you, industries in other parts of the country? I just don't think you can.
Yeah, I mean the I don't know if I say the hostility, but like the public airing of grievances between Alberta's premier. Alberta's premier for sure. Alberta's opposition leader. I think
Alberta's premier is overjoyed at the situation.
That's what I asked Supriya Dwivedi yesterday. I said, "Who's more excited about this? Like, is Danielle Smith the most excited about this? Because for Naheed Nenshi, he's in a really tough spot. Yeah. Same deal with Carla Beck in Saskatchewan. Both opposition leaders, both NDP leaders, are basically telling him to pound sand, which is wild. And then Manitoba's premier, another prairie premier, but an NDP one at that, says, I love the guy. Those are his exact words.
Yeah, we'll wait and see what Mr. Lewis has to say about the Churchill project, because he came out pretty strongly against some aspects of that too. So I think as long as you're starting to say no to the types of development that provides jobs for traditional NDP voters, those big facility union jobs, you're, a symptom of what's led to the decline in the NDP vote in most regions of the country. Maybe Avi Lewis knows something different about accessible voters in other demographics, but that's not the traditional NDP voter. I'm not an NDP member, so I don't have a vote in that, but I think it'll be interesting to see how you do that on the prairies. I don't understand it.
Andrew Leach is a professor of economics and law at the University of Alberta. You can check out aleach.ca. We'll link to it in the show notes on the podcast and on YouTube. Give him a follow on X at Andrew_Leach. Awesome to see you here in person, man.
That was a lot of fun.
Thank you for making time for us. Don't forget to grab your cold beer out of the beer fridge from Super Chat Ken. All right. Thanks, Andrew. Coming up in just a moment, we'll continue the conversation. Hey, check out Kubi Renewable Energy online, kubi.ca. If you take a look right now, you're going to find, obviously, a bunch of different options, including solar by Kubi, and this is what they do best. This is what's put them on the map, so to speak. 11 years in running. These are a couple of oil field electricians who saw a big opportunity in renewables, started with one pickup truck, and they've built themselves up to be the busiest solar installer west of Ontario. Unbelievable. unbelievable success story. You can build your quote today on their website. That's also a great way to connect with their engineers. They can map out your project, give you a sense of what you're looking at, whether you're going on top of a residence, a barn, or an office tower. Heck, they did the Edmonton Convention Center. Looks absolutely unbelievable. Next time you're in that neck of the woods, if you're anywhere near, check it out. It's the cleanest install we've seen in a long time. Kubi is solar simplified, people powered, but their spring installation schedule's filling quickly. If you want to have them up on your roof, saving you money by this summer, reach out today to kubi.ca. This is a message presented by the Alberta Teachers Association. When 51,000 spoke up for Alberta students, what did the government do? They suspended teachers' charter rights to collective bargaining. They made it harder for Alberta's teachers to speak out for what students need at school. They did it by invoking the notwithstanding clause, and they didn't have to. Alberta's teachers want you to know that the government had other options. And that's why the Alberta Teachers Association is taking the government to court to get teachers' charter rights restored. They're not going to stop advocating for students because it shouldn't be wrong to speak up for kids. You can check out progressnotpromises.ca for more on this. This is a message from the Alberta Teachers Association. Our friends at Friesen Brothers have you covered if you're going to be hosting for Easter or just getting the family together over the next while. You're going to want to check out cateringbyfriesen.com. They have, of course, their Easter dinner box options, including the classic dinner. They've also got their vegan dinner, and then they've got one that basically ticks all the boxes. The idea behind all of this, of course, is that you let the Friesen Brothers chefs handle all the heavy lifting. These are the Red Seal chefs that are responsible for what Friesen Brothers has been known for years, and that is giving you more quality time with the people that matter most. Check out the classic Easter dinner box online at cateringbyfriesen.com. It's an unbelievable price. You can easily feed 4 people for $99 plus GST. You can order all the way through till April 9th. Again, all details online at cateringbyfriesen.com. And Johnny, how fantastic was it just this past Friday to have the team in from the Ben Stelter Foundation in
great.
studio? Wasn't that wonderful? You're seeing Ashif Maji there on the screen, a successful entrepreneur, a philanthropist that's really pouring his heart into the work that the Ben Stelter Foundation is doing. We had a pediatric oncologist in the house, and of course, we had Ben Stelter's dad, Mike, joining us as well. A wonderful conversation. If you missed it, you can check it out on our archives on the podcast or on YouTube. Of course, that was the 27th of March. All of this leading up to the Hearts and Hands Poker Tournament. And I'm inviting you to join me there. Come take all my money, friends. Go to benstelterfoundation.com to register. This is the 16th and 17th of April at Pure Casino Yellowhead with up to $50,000 in cash and prizes. Ashif explains how they're working the prizes. This is amazing. You get to pick from the prize list based on your order of finish, including a Breitling watch and a ton of other amazing alternatives. But of course, the idea is we're all working together to bring the Ben Stelter Center for Proton Therapy and Neuroscience to Edmonton. We're bringing it to Canada. Canada is the only G7 nation without proton therapy as an option for families that are staring down cancer, in particular with the youngest patients. I hope that you'll join me at the Hearts and Hands Poker Tournament coming up April 16th and 17th. Register today at benstelterfoundation.com. All right, well, let's continue this conversation. Our thanks to Professor Andrew Leach, an unbelievable job setting the table for this check-in. Canada is at an inflection point on major projects. Alberta's really feeling it, to say the least, maybe more than any other province. And a new report from the Business Council of Alberta argues that federal approvals, or at least the process, are choking off investment. It's delaying projects and sending capital elsewhere. We're hours away from that April 1st deadline. If you're listening to this after April 1st, we're already there, and the stakes are immediate. The question is, can Canada actually get big things built anymore? We're grateful to have the president of the Business Council of Alberta, Adam Legge, and Alex Pourbaix joining us. Alex is the board chair at Cenovus Energy. Welcome, both of you, to Real Talk. Thank you so much for making time for us today. Alex, I'm not sure if you had a chance. We'll roll in hot to catch our conversation there with Andrew Leach, but I wanted to pick up on the Pathways project, and he obviously laid it out, said it might be a tough sell right now to shareholders, to investors. What's your response? You know it obviously very well.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ryan. I think what I would say about pathways, and I've been saying this for years. Canada has this extraordinary benefit of some of the largest oil and gas reserves in the world. I mean, depending on who you listen to, our oil reserves are third or fourth on the entire planet. And we've all seen over the past couple of years how important those resources are for the world, not just for jobs, investment, but also for energy security. And I think what I've always said, we have this great resource, but at the same time, we are not on the low cost end. Industry is very supportive of continuing to improve its already excellent environmental performance, and that includes where we can reducing our carbon emissions. But everybody has to realize there is no return associated with carbon capture and sequestration. It is purely a cost to our business. And if the demands are unreasonable, it very simply is going to mean that resource is not competitive globally. It's not going to continue to be developed, and Canada is not going to be able to grow its position as a supplier with all of the myriad benefits that delivers to the economy in wages, taxes, you name it.
Adam, I want to give you a chance to chime in on this as well. Kind of an interesting point from Professor Leach, who, if I can paraphrase, said the message can't be that Canada's oil and gas future is so precarious that 30 or 40 cents a barrel would make it unprofitable. He said that there needs to be a different message sent to Canadians and the international community. What do you say to that?
Well, I think right now the public opinion in Canada is very much behind everything from building major projects, developing our resources, getting those resources to other markets, diversifying our trade basket to be less reliant on the United States. So, quite frankly, I think Canadians are ready. They've seen the impact from a decade where we have not invested in major projects, in infrastructure, and getting our resources to market. So I think Canadians are quite prepared to support developing our resources, getting them into pipelines, to ports. I mean, whether that is oil and gas, whether that is agriculture. I know Professor Leach was focused very much on the oil and gas sector, but to be honest, there's so much investment that hasn't happened in Canada that spans our entire economy. The Port of Vancouver, our West Coast ports just are not effective and efficient shipping our agricultural products. We saw Nutrien make an investment in Washington State as opposed to a Canadian port because they didn't have confidence in Canada's major project approval process. So I think it's really time to make some improvements to that so that we can actually bring that investment back to Canada. We can increase jobs and generate the prosperity the Canadians have lost over the past 10 years.
Okay, so both of you, I would imagine, have been keeping an eye on April 1st. This is this major project's deadline, as they say. Although I get this. I mean, it's not like if nothing is agreed and signed off on by April 1st, everything's dead in the water, right? But Alex, obviously you look at Cenovus Energy, you look at the entire energy sector. I mean, this is obviously a huge focus. I know that there has been some optimism around that memorandum of understanding that the Premier of Alberta and the Prime Minister signed, and there was also some healthy skepticism, some cynicism around it as well. How have you been approaching that April 1st deadline mentally and otherwise, and what are you looking for beyond that date?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not involved in the day-to-day negotiations anymore at Pathways, but one thing that's very clear, you have all three parties, being the federal government, the provincial government, and the Pathways producers, are completely engaged in discussions and negotiations. I think there's a lot of goodwill to getting a deal done, but as I said earlier, there's no point getting a deal if it's a deal that isn't going to see the growth coming in the industry that everybody is relying on. And the term I always hear used is people have to accept a little water with their wine. And I think there's a deal to be done, but it's going to require compromise on everybody's part, and it has to result in a competitive industry. Or, as I said, there's really no point in going forward with it if no future production is going to be is going to come out of this whole thing.
What does the water in the wine look like so that the average layperson understands?
Well, I mean, just very simply, one of the points that I think Canadians really should understand, as far as I'm aware, Canada is the only oil and gas producing country in the world, material oil and gas producing country in the world, that has proposed emission caps, has proposed, very significant carbon tax on the industry. And as I said, in the US, our largest competitor, and I would argue most effective competitor, they're not doing any of this. And not only that, and Adam can probably talk to this, they are vastly driving down their regulatory timelines, their regulatory burdens, with the realization that oil and gas is are incredibly important national security elements for them. So we just have to be very cognizant that the more cost and uncertainty that we put on this industry, the more challenging it is going to be. And so, water with the wine. I mean, I think there's got to be a sharing of the costs associated with this, and there has to be realism about what kind of burden the industry and the country can bear if we expect to have this industry continue to be one of the most profitable and successful industries in the country.
Adam, I want to give you a chance to respond to that, what Alex has put in front of us, but we talk a lot, and Dr. Leach was talking about it as well, on, some of this is economics, and then a lot of this is politics too. How do you process what Alex just said in the context of that? A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B?
Well, the economic argument is clear. I mean, Canada, the World Bank did a study on regulatory regimes in different countries around the world. There were 100 countries they evaluated. Canada ranked 33rd. We were one notch better than China at 34. The United States was at number 5. Over the past decade, business investment per worker has declined 11% in Canada. It's grown over 35% in the United States. So the economic argument is that no one's investing in Canada because the regime just does not support certainty, predictability, and confidence. And so if you want to talk about what that looks like, it means we're not able to afford the social services that are generated through tax revenue, paid for through tax revenues. But so political leaders, I think, is important to recognize that we are losing out economically. Many of our members have made no secret of the fact that they prefer the investment climates in the United States and other jurisdictions like Australia to Canada. They're putting their dollars there. But as I mentioned also, public opinion is very strong for developing our resources, for exporting our resources, for diversifying our trade basket. So I think every politician looks for the parade that they can march alongside. You've got Canadians rallying this in a moment where they are feeling the national pride around Canada's interests and diversifying away from the United States. But they're also seeing what's going on around the world, saying Canada could be helping allies around the world with energy resources, but we simply can't. We don't have the export infrastructure to be able to take the pressure valve off what we're seeing in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. So I think we're seeing the outcome of an underinvestment, a poor regulatory regime. The political opinion is there. The economic argument of what we have lost over the past 10 years is there. So I think those are very promising and important signs for any political leader to be saying, okay, we've got to change things. We've got to change things fast.
Alex, prior to your service as chair of the board at Cenovus, you were president and CEO for 6 or 7 years, right? I'm curious to pick your brain, just generally speaking, on the impact of the war in Iran and what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz and the impact, in particular, opportunities and otherwise, for Canada's oil sands and for energy companies in Canada. What are you seeing, and through your experience, what are you taking away from it at this stage, noting that could change in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, and I think there's sort of short-term impacts and longer-term impacts. And what I would say, you've obviously seen the short-term impact. We've seen Brent crude, WTI crude surge over $100 a barrel. That is directly related to the fear of attacks by the Iranians on the waterborne tankers in the Straits of Hormuz. If you take a look at the forward markets, and I always think they're a better predictor of this than any economist, they are very much backwardated, and by that I mean the forward markets are assuming that this is a short-term impact. I think that's very accurate. The media has made a lot, in suggesting that Iran is fighting back forcefully and is causing significant problems. I think the reality is that this is going to come to an end in a relatively short time. That's what the markets are betting on. The short term, it obviously brings benefit to the industry in terms of higher prices, higher netbacks. I think the more important reaction to this is the entire world has really realized, I think, how important, particularly oil, but oil and LNG are to the global economy and to prosperity around the world. And I think what that has done is made people realize that Canada is really an extraordinary opportunity to not just continue to supply the 4 or 5 million barrels a day, but potentially significantly increase that. And that, I think, is the really important point. You're seeing, global oil and gas producers are looking at Canada in a way that they haven't, just because of the quality of that resource. And whether it gets developed, as Adam is I think, very elegantly stated, right now the global investment community has been very, very worried about the Canadian government's commitment to this industry, the commitment to get pipelines built, commitment to allow new production to proceed. So there's this incredible opportunity created by this tragic circumstance. And time will tell if Canada seizes that opportunity.
Alex, are you saying that's like under Prime Minister Carney currently? I mean, that sounds like what I heard people say about Justin Trudeau's federal government for a number of years. But you get the sense that international investors and big companies are nervous about the banker, about Mark Carney, about signing MOUs and talking about energy expansion and lifting the consumer carbon tax. I mean, those seem to me to be positives. If you know the world better than I do in this context, but those strike me as good signs, not red flags.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Prime Minister Carney's public statements on the industry in Canada and his hope for Canada to become an energy superpower, though those are very, very positive directional statements. What I spend a lot of time with investors in our industry, and what I would tell you, they're pretty cynical, pretty hard bitten. And I mean, I think they would agree directionally that's positive. What they're looking for is regulatory reform that actually will allow pipelines to be built, will allow production to grow. And that's what we're waiting for. And as I said, directionally, I think the Prime Minister's comments are super supportive, but trust me, investors are not going to invest tens of billions of dollars on positive statements. They're going to wait to see hard regulatory reform in conditions that allow this industry to grow.
It's been interesting, Adam, to take a quick look through this From Barriers to Breakthroughs report. This has just been released by your team at Business Council Alberta. We'll link to it in the show notes. People can check out businesscouncilab.com or just Google From Barriers to Breakthroughs. But you guys have said that you've talked to like 150 economists, legal experts, policy specialists, business leaders, and you're calling for, I don't know if I say an overhaul, but let's say it, an overhaul to the regulatory process in Canada for the average person to sound like the smartest person in their peer group and be able to put a couple of points in front of them. What are a couple takeaways that the average Canadian should understand about this report and about what the Business Council's calling for?
Well, really, this, Ryan, is about unlocking prosperity for Canadians. We just haven't had the investment in Canada for the past couple of decades, to be honest. And so Canadians have suffered. And so what this would do would be to enable big projects, big investment to happen all across the country faster, with more certainty. We'd bring, the Prime Minister has an ambition to unlock $1 trillion of private capital over the next 5 years. We need that investment in Canada. That creates jobs, that creates new companies, that creates tax revenues that pay for schools, doctors, churches, teachers, nurses, etc. All those things that Canadians want. And this is not just an Alberta thing. This will enable us to invest in ports in Montreal and BC. This will enable us to invest in mines in Northern Ontario. This will enable us to create interties for electricity in the Maritimes. So this is something that will give a shot in the arm to the Canadian economy so that we can become the leaders in the world today. It's our time right now, Ryan, for Canada to lead, to generate prosperity and wealth, to generate jobs and paychecks. It's our time to support our allies. It's our time to achieve economic strength and growth. So I would say this is really about enabling the Canadian economy and generating jobs and prosperity. That's what it's all about, and that's through the mechanism of investing in big projects and creating the certainty and the pathway for that to happen faster, more predictably than we do now. So that, as Alex says, investors will say, when they're looking at Canada and the US, they say, Canada's actually looking pretty good right now. Let's put our capital there. They've got a ton of resources, a ton of great people, great talent. Let's put our money there.
I'll ask both of you this in closing. Do you get the sense that what's happening, not just, internationally, but even if we take a look at the Canada-U.S. relationship and, Kuzma negotiations and some of Trump's aggression, economic and otherwise, do you see it like on the ground changing attitudes tangibly in Canada around things like interprovincial trade or obviously broadening our export strategy or developing new markets, social license attitudes changing around pipelines? Alex, do you see it?
100%. And I think you mentioned it in the intro that, I spent a good part of my career developing very large scale pipelines, trying to get access to Tidewater. And, obviously the biggest among those was Energy East, which would have right now, had it been approved, would have been delivering over 1 million barrels a day of oil to Tidewater on the US and the Canadian East Coast. And at the time, I think there was really a view that I think has been proven incorrect with the passage of time, that oil and gas were sunset industries, that we were all going to be flying around in battery-powered planes and driving battery or plug-in cars. And the reality is very different than that. And, I think what we've seen just generally, I think Canadians are much more understanding of the requirement for these resources in the world. And then on top of that, I think the other issue is with these challenges with the U.S. and with President Trump, I think Canadians are starting to appreciate there is a very important national focus on diversifying our markets for our energy. And, if you look at the polling in Quebec, in the Maritimes, in BC, as Adam has said, it is very, very strongly moved in favor of facilitating those kind of export markets.
Adam, last word to you.
Yeah, no, Ryan, we when we put out a platform last year for the federal election, we polled Canadians on a variety of issues, and we asked them, do you support growth in investment in our major infrastructure? And over 75% of Canadians said, yes, we want to see that. We asked if they support investing in and exporting more of our natural resources. And again, over 70% of Canadians said yes to that. So public opinion has shifted. I think they recognize that we went too far. The pendulum swung too far under the Trudeau era with respect to some of the environmental regulations and controls, a very cumbersome, slow, unpredictable, and costly regulatory approval process. And that Canada has lost out on investment in jobs and company creation. So I think they're seeing what that cost Canada and are ready to support that. And I encourage the federal government to lean into the public support for this. And we are all in on the Prime Minister's ambitions to be an energy superpower, to grow our trade basket, to attract $1 trillion. We 100% support him. We're all in on that. However we can help, we're there. And we've given them a roadmap of how they can do that from a regulatory perspective. So let's put the wind in our sails. Let's get on with it, and let's get building in Canada.
What do you think, Alex? Is there going to be a new pipeline built from Alberta through BC?
Yeah, I think ultimately, I think that is a very necessary piece of infrastructure. And I think the only thing that we have to think about is, there are right now a number of competing proposals that are more brownfield proposals to bring oil down to the U.S. And they have the advantage that, they're going to be cheaper tolls to get oil to Tidewater down through the Texas coast. So I do think there is a role for that West Coast pipeline. And I think it's just, how are they phased and what goes first? But this is an industry that could clearly over time add several million barrels a day of production. And we're going to need all the pipelines to do it. So I do think ultimately that West Coast pipeline is super important and would be just a boon for the Canadian economy.
That's Alex Pourbaix, chair of the board at Cenovus Energy. Adam Legge, the Business Council of Alberta president. You can check them out online at businesscouncilab.com. Their new report out, available to the public, From Barriers to Breakthroughs. Thanks to the both of you for hanging out with us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Glad to be here.
You got
Thanks,
it.
Ryan.
Yeah, Real Talkers, let us know what you think about what you just heard. We're going to check in on our live chat powered by Park Power in just a moment here. Hey, I'm not surprised. I'm never surprised to see a diverse offering of opinion in our live chat. That's the beauty of this show. That's the beauty of this audience. And, of course, you can always leave a comment on our YouTube episode if you're watching this later, or send us an email to talk@ryanjesperson.com. We want to get there in just a second. Before we do, if you want to talk about economy, if you want to talk about your family's economy, you want to talk about your business's bottom line, I trust North Road Investment Council as a steady hand and a studied voice, as a guide through wealth and investing. And that's what many discerning families, associations, organizations do as well, with wealth accumulation and investment advisory services for clients both inside and outside of Alberta. I want to give you a heads up in the next episode of the show. Coming up on April 1st, that's a Wednesday, Marshall McAllister's in from North Road Investment Council, and he's bringing one of his team members. I've been telling you about this team member that is solely focused on digital risk advisory services. Now you're going to go, really, an investment council? The firm is offering digital risk advisory. They are leaders in digital risk advice within the wealth management industry. This is a way for North Road clients to make better and safer choices in their digitally connected life. So a heads up, the next episode of the show, there's going to be some valuable information that could save us all huge headaches. If you'd like to check out their digital risk quiz in the meantime, you can find it at northroadic.com. It takes literally 1 minute, and you'll be better equipped to understand that conversation and maybe keep an eye out for some key details. We recommend North Road Investment Council as a second set of eyes on your current investment strategy. What do you have to lose? They can work with you on an hourly basis, and they offer a discounted rate for Real Talkers. Make sure you mention our name when you reach out to North Road Investment Council at northroadic.com. We're super excited to be supporting Northwest Film Fest, again kicking off April 8th, running through the 14th at the Metro Cinema at the Garneau in Alberta's capital city. Tickets are now on sale at northwestfest.ca. You can check out the full lineup, including those all-access passes that give you, well, basically carte blanche to check out all of these offerings, and they are aplenty. It's going to be an unbelievable year at Northwest Film Fest, including the showcasing a ton of films made right here in Edmonton, the premiere of local films like Dolph Unbreakable, the story of action hero Dolph Lundgren. They've got Never Get Busted, which is the amazing story of Barry Cooper. He was a highly decorated Texas narcotics officer, and then he turned on the police force, started busting crooked cops. teaching drug users how to hide their stash. Pretty wild stuff. Ali Eats America, another crowd pleaser that they're showcasing this year at Northwest Film Fest. Ali Eats America is the story of a young man diagnosed with cancer, becomes inspired by Anthony Bourdain. He was watching Parts Unknown, and he plots a road trip across America to revel in different foods once he finishes his chemo. It's an inspiring story. I mean, there is film after film after film. You owe it to yourself to check it out at northwestfest.ca. We have a Real Talk Roundtable, a filmmakers roundtable coming up, which we're excited about. And we'll have special incentives for our Real Talk patrons, our Patreon supporters, and our YouTube channel subscribers. Keep an eye out for that later this week. You can get your passes today. Check out the full schedule at northwestfest.ca. And John, I got to say, I'm wearing one of my favorite casual blazers today. This is one of the most versatile blazers I own. This is called a Bolioli. Bolioli. It's just so fun to say. It works with a t-shirt, it works with a dress shirt, it works with dress pants, it works with jeans, and hey guys, you'll never guess where I found it. I picked it up at the Helm Clothing, an unbelievable 3-story luxury retail experience in downtown Edmonton on 103rd Street. Right by the rink, right by the Real Talk studio, and always online at thehelmclothing.com. You can explore their latest arrivals, including the Stone Island collection. I got a few questions about that vest I was wearing the other day. You can explore Stone Island and all of their latest arrivals on their website. That's thehelmclothing.com. Don't forget, if you order online, when you order online at The Helm Clothing, the promo code REALTALK will knock 10% off your entire order. Nice bit of savings there for you. That's Real Talk, all one word, when you're online at thehelmclothing.com. You can check out the latest from Brunello Cucinelli, by the way. They've got unbelievable footwear there if you're really looking to elevate your smart casual game. And of course, Helm offers made to measure, made for you. Nobody does it like Chad Helm and the team at The Helm. You can find them online today at thehelmclothing.com. Well, I appreciate all the feedback to our conversations back-to-back Jacks with economist Andrew Leach, and then, of course, Alex Pourbaix and Adam Legge with the Business Council of Alberta, Cenovus Energy as well. I saw a comment in here. We don't shy away from these. We're not afraid of these types of comments, but I saw Whitestream in there said the latest, the most recent conversation said this was an odd conversation. He says it feels like a paid advertisement. I'll let you guys know. We always disclose when something is sponsored content, we would call it, or a paid advertisement. That's not a paid advertisement. That's the former CEO of Cenovus Energy, who's the board chair there. Obviously, they're big players in the Pathways Project, and the Business Council of Alberta is a well-known and widely respected business advocacy group in Western Canada. So you want to get different sides of the conversation. You want to get, I wouldn't say both sides of the coin, because I don't think that Dr. Leach is inherently opposing anything that those two were talking about. But we want to give you different angles on stories so you can best understand them. That's the point. And I lead the charge, John, with me. I want to best understand these stories. And I think that Dr. Leach did a great job of setting the table for us to understand what changes and what doesn't on April 1st. I'll be honest, I had no idea that the large emitter changes, the carbon tax changes, had no impact on large industrial producers, players that are doing business in Alberta. I think that's an important clarification. Interesting to hear his take on how attitudes may have changed around the consumer carbon tax and the like. I haven't heard, there were a lot of people, and I won't say bitching about, because when you say someone's bitching about something, you kind of imply that they have no reason to present their complaint, or that their complaint is without merit, or their problem is without merit. And I don't think that that's the case. But a lot of people that were adamantly opposing the consumer carbon tax, you haven't heard a lot of talk about changes to their everyday life or changes to their bottom line
not at all.
Since the consumer carbon tax was eliminated. It was like it just evaporated from the conversation. And maybe the feds got very little credit for it, or maybe it's contributing to what Mark Carney's poll numbers look like, including in Alberta. I mean, maybe that's a big part of it that nobody really says out loud.
They definitely got zero credit for it. I still talk to people and they're like, the carbon tax, and I'm like, but it's gone. And they're like, but grocery prices, because that was the main complaint, right? That carbon tax, transportation, all that stuff was contributing to the cost of bread, the cost of eggs, the cost of vegetables from Mexico and from California and wherever. And it's clear that, like, I mean, although they had a mild impact on it, that, you know, grocery producers and food producers pretty much, I mean, food growers, not food growers, but food producers and people who put the stickers on the actual food are the majority of the influence and the people who set the prices. So, yeah.
Galen Weston.
No, but
Avi Lewis is calling him out by name.
Oh,
Avi
yeah.
Lewis wants to go to war with Galen Weston.
My mother was just in town. She's in Ontario, and she, you know, she's in the nursing field, and she doesn't know a lot about geopolitics, but she does know that, like, when she goes into Shoppers Drug Mart and PC and like our friend, we had another person here yesterday talking about it, and into Loblaws, like, these are all, the money is all funneling to the same people, right?
Yeah.
She's not blind about that.
Yeah, Whiteroom's continuing on saying YouTube used to have a policy that paid ads have to be disclosed. Buddy, I don't give a fuck about YouTube's policy. My own personal editorial policy is we let you know when we're partnering with groups. And anyway, it's fine. I know that some of you, like, you don't want to hear from industry. Like Lightning Rod says, I call bullshit on this. And I see my good buddy.
I would like to hear more from industry.
Wouldn't you?
Yeah,
I mean,
I want to know what they're thinking.
Mark Doran in here says this. And Mark I have a lot of love and a lot of respect for Mark, a landowner advocate. And he was on the show recently within the last month. Killed it, by the way. Did an amazing job. He says, translated, we want no regulation and government subsidy. He says, don't buy this crock of shit. That from Mark, that's fine. But listen, guys, we want to have the conversation. If you want to talk about pipelines, if you want to talk about energy, if you want to talk about the Pathways Project, do you want to, like, check in with the former CEO of Cenovus, who's the board chair, or do you want to, like, go to a bunch of anonymous accounts on Twitter who are, like, lighting their hair on fire and get your information from them? I would rather go to the source. You don't have to love everything you hear here. That's not the point. The show's going to get people on the record and ask direct questions, and then you can sift through their responses or analyze them as you do. Tracy says oil and gas companies have invested heavily in cannabis. That's interesting. It says, I suspect they'll invest in critical minerals as well. We're probably not talking enough about critical minerals. There's a huge conversation to be had there. And it's on our list, and it is something that recurs as a real issue and something that's relevant, of course. Canada has, when we talk about our natural resources, it's not just oil, gas, and water, with apologies to, like, fisheries and lumber and everything else, ag. Obviously, we understand our resources are robust, and Canada is a wonderful place, I think, to do business and, of course, to invest. Gabe says, let's make pipelines cool again. Okay. Lightning Rod says, I suggest Markham Hislop for a counter to this narrative. Yeah, guys, Markham's on all the time. Max Fawcett's coming up on the 13th of April. What else do we say? I mean, there's a ton of stuff here. Denis says public risk and corporate profit just doesn't work for the taxpayer. To a certain degree, that's 100% true. And obviously, I think the taxpayer appetites, if you want to talk about investing, for example, in new pipelines, it's got to be a non-starter. It's got to be a non-starter. The government can do what it can to incentivize this, but the investment's got to come from outside the public purse. Do we all agree? Let me know what you think. With an email into the show. Aurora Astra says there's a big difference between good regulation and any regulation. These guys come across like they want no regulation so business can thrive at the expense of society. Interesting comment. Dwayne says, making a clear point, and Dwayne has established himself in our chat as somebody who's really trying to drive our focus to water. And I appreciate that, Dwayne, because that conversation, everybody says water's the new oil. Dwayne here says water's more important than oil is. It's interesting. It's almost like a lot of us, and I'm guilty of this sometimes too, not that we don't value water, but we don't talk about our water reserves, or we don't talk about, like, the value of water in, like, a price per barrel context, or we don't talk about, like, international developments that would impact our water security, do we? It's only when threats arise, when Donald Trump's making comments about the imaginary line border or the 51st state, and Canadians realize that this administration and maybe America, generally speaking, has eyes on Canada's natural resources. And over the years and over the decades to come, water is going to be a bigger and bigger part of that conversation. It's obvious. When do we pay attention to it? We pay attention when there are large industrial projects, or for that matter, large developments. It doesn't all have to be industry. A lot of times you're talking about things like big shopping malls outside of cities, but where water diversion permits are granted. And you'll hear then from stakeholders, oftentimes it's those in the ag community that are raising the red flag, that are trying to get everybody's attention. But it tends to fly under the radar. This is my long-winded way, Dwayne, of thanking you for your continued advocacy in our chat. Erica says, I wouldn't go so far as to call that last conversation bullshit, but it's clearly two guys lobbying hard for their industry. Yeah, it wasn't presented as anything but. Jillian says the entire world isn't just now noticing how important oil is, but a lot of us are wondering how the hell we've dragged our feet on renewables so badly that we're still so oil dependent. Aurora goes on to say, by the way, the issue is the political gamesmanship with industry. Danielle Smith, Justin Trudeau, Pierre Poilievre are all guilty of this. Mark Carney has been the most steady and reasonable in a decade. I do think that that's one of the kind of like X factors, or as they may say, Johnny and La Belle Province, the je ne sais quoi about Carney, is that he's had this ability that no politician has in Canada, at least for the past number of years, to kind of cross those partisan lines. Can we say blur the partisan lines and attract supporters or support, whether it's temporary or permanent? Everything in politics is probably temporary to a certain degree, from across those partisan lines. So you get a lot of people that would identify as progressive conservatives that can support this government based on this sort of steadfastness or the credibility they see from Mark Carney. And maybe at to some degree, and Supriya talked about this in our most recent episode, the 30th of March, check that out. Maybe there's a shelf life on that. Like at some point he's got to deliver. Right now it's a vibe, but there's got to be proof of performance.
I think so, and that's I like how we talked about April 1st today. We're waiting to see what comes in 24, 48 hours if all this stuff that's promised starts moving in here in Alberta. But yeah, I mean, we had someone, I won't mention their name, in the studio the other day, very conservative, and they said the same thing. They said, I'm not going to lie, I feel much more calmer since Carney's come in. Like, they agreed. They said the arrow is in the right direction. Now, whether that arrow turns from right direction to upward momentum is what we still haven't seen. Yeah,
that person's an ardent conservative, and we would never reveal this because there is that Las Vegas rule here in the Real Talk studio off air. But they disclosed to us that there's a very good chance that they will be voting Liberal next federal election out of nowhere, and I believe for the first time in their life. And I wasn't even asking them; they disclosed this. But
my eyes popped out. I'm like.
And this person is not. Wow. They're focused on economy. You know, I mean, it was like that, Jason, when Andrew referenced that podium sign, jobs, economy, pipelines. Right.
This person didn't, but might as well have had an F Trudeau sticker on their car. You know what I mean? Like,
wow.
But they were angry. They were angry with the way things have been going for the last decade, and in a year, they've flipped around. So this isn't like it's not BS when we're on here talking about people are feeling calmer, are feeling like the temperature has been turned down. There are actual staunch conservatives who are moving more to the middle just because of Carney.
Yeah. And then this comes back to what Steve Outhouse's strategy is for Pierre Poilievre. And, I keep referencing the Joe Rogan interview. I mean, it's so much more than that. But that was one example of, I think, what Pierre Poilievre's doing. They recognize that dealing with, I'm about to say something so obvious, I'm going to insult you all. Sorry, it's so obvious. But campaigning against or opposing, let's say, the leader of the official opposition, opposing Mark Carney is very different than opposing Justin Trudeau and requires a dramatically different strategy, right? Trudeau is, for all of his confidence, is he still dating Katy Perry? I haven't seen them in the news lately.
Did that heavy, buddy.
Did that kind of fizzle out, or are they still together?
I'm on a blog. I get daily updates.
You're our official pop culture correspondent.
TMZ updates. They are like fully. You know, Davos was the thing. We're not going to do this for long, Real Talkers.
And I'll get back to my point, I promise.
Stick with me for 45 seconds. Davos was the part when I was like, okay, this is real. Because it's one thing to get over a divorce and Katy Perry and all these things and go out. And a lot of it is for just for show and try to fill the empty holes in your soul. It's another thing to go to Davos for like an important government meeting and meeting of world minds and walk down the street holding hands and like be seen out for dinner and be seen you know what I mean? It's not like partying on a yacht, right? So, but yeah, I'm getting daily updates on this blog and it's like,
oh, you're being serious? I thought you were joking.
Yeah, people are still like, oh my God.
What's the blog?
This is 100%. Get out of here. We're not pulling this up right now.
But the point I wanted
had
to
another
make.
point. My point was about Carney. Even Poilievre. That was my point because you brought up Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah.
You can tell, and he hasn't 180'd, but you can even tell that Poilievre and his team must see that the way Carney is, the way he's calm and reserved and answers questions slowly and thought-provoked and not throwing grenades over to the other side, although in the House it is still pretty back and forth like that. He's even changed his demeanor on the Joe Rogan podcast, but flighting down conspiracy theories, being very calm, thinking about his answers. Him and Mark Carney, I know that was an outlier because it was children who died, but when they had the school shooting and he went out there and they're holding hands, him talking about personally text messaging Mark Carney when he's in the States and updating on his status and who he's talking to. All this stuff is. We talk about stealing ideas from the other side. He's pulling from Carney's side because he sees that people enjoy when the temperature gets turned down.
And I would say, and I will always appreciate Justin Trudeau's availability to this show, his willingness to grant interviews. He deserves a lot of credit for that. There's things I give him a ton of credit for. I've shared this on the show before, but people don't know. He came in, we interviewed him on Real Talk 3 times. As Prime Minister, I've interviewed him 6 times total, and his team has never once asked for any advanced questions. So what I'm saying is he comes in, he sits down at the table, and he just takes questions with no prep. That he deserves a lot of credit for that. But I will say this, and I want to make the point that Justin Trudeau is, and he's a very confident person, obviously tall, dark, and handsome, comes from wealth, dates international pop stars, but he is easy. He's an easy target for comedians. He's easy to poke fun at. The way that he talks, the blackface stuff, there's a lot of things. It's easy to poke fun at him. Carney's a whole different animal. You can't, you're coming from a guy that has this illustrious and highly successful international career. He's an Ivy League grad. He's probably the first Canadian prime minister maybe in history, and maybe Paul Martin would classify this as well, considering that he came from wealth and had the shipping. He was a shipping magnate, this, that, and the other. But Carney doesn't need to be prime minister. And if you talk to people close to him or people that claim to be close to him or have an inside perspective on it, they're like, he doesn't want this job forever. He had to be convinced to campaign for the job, and he came back to do his part to save Canada. Some of you are puking in your mouth as I'm saying this, but that's a fact. That's what people are saying. And so when you're dealing with, as Poilievre, you're opposing a figure like that, a political force like that, it's tough because it's a completely different landscape. And I think if you come across as trying to, the whole drama teacher thing with Trudeau and nice socks, nice hair, drama teacher, blackface, you're trying to discredit him. You're trying to poke fun at him. You're trying to ensure that people see him less seriously than he sees himself or than he would like to be seen. And if you try that game against Carney, it's going to blow up in your face.
100%.
And so that's the challenge Poilievre has now, is that Carney's appealing to a broader base. It looks like this April 1st deadline will pass, and of course that's a story we'll keep an eye on, but that doesn't make it an abject failure. But there are deliverables here on Canadian soil, including negotiations with the provinces and, of course, the free trade agreement with the U.S. And Carney, to a certain degree, is definitely on the clock there.
Yeah, and look, Carney on paper, that's why when people are like, Carney's an idiot, they resort to insults. I'm not an intellectual, but anyone who sees someone who has a degree in economics from Harvard, first off, should just be listened to when you're talking about the economy. If this was a conservative, graduated from Oxford, degree in economics, not only that, University of Oxford as well has a master's in economics and a doctorate, a PhD in economics. Played hockey. This guy, if this was Pierre Poilievre's resume, people would be yelling from the mountaintops, why is this guy not running the country? You know what I mean? So it's impossible to argue that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I think the second part that you were talking about is just the way he's reserved. He doesn't take bait. He never takes bait. And his answers are very refined. They're very slow. They're very well thought out. Now, whether all that pays off is still, I'm saying it as well. Like I think the last year things have been calmer. You can be a little more at ease with the guy who's sitting in the big chair at the top. But I do think I agree with Linda Steele. Like now, April 1st onward, we need to see some actual success, some things paying off, right? A shovel in the ground, something signed. I know Alberta wants it with a pipeline, like a shovel in the ground, some actual momentum on the housing builds that he's been talking about. All those things, like they need to actually begin.
Yeah, Avi Lewis talking about that. He's got to do what he's got to do to get the attention of the nation.
3-4 years and
he's talking about what did he say? Like a public builder, like a federal public home builder to build. What did they call them? Not off market,
like
homes
a Bob
or
the
something
Builder
like
type
that.
position.
But it's just and they'll have their own solutions. And the public grocery stores, he talked about that with us. You can check out our interview with Avi Lewis. Just Google Avi Lewis Real Talk and you'll find it. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not it creates a ripple effect in Canadian politics. Avi Lewis certainly has his work cut out for him, but his job, and I think where a lot of people felt like Jagmeet Singh fell short, or there's kind of this. And I'm not an NDP supporter. I'm not an NDP member at either level. But my point is here, I'm saying I don't speak for them. But what I have noticed anecdotally is that I think that the NDP base seemed to be kind of split in two on Jagmeet Singh and his party's strategy when they supported the Justin Trudeau Liberals with that kind of voting block, that allowed the Trudeau government to maintain confidence and to get its budgets passed and the like to survive. It was getting things like, the dental plan or pharmacare, or like having sort of the party's top priorities reflected in liberal spending and in liberal investment. And that was the key. But I think a lot of other NDP supporters felt like Jagmeet Singh propped up the Trudeau government and allowed it to survive without fully realizing the potential that it should have. In other words, it didn't get its votes worth. Like it wasn't worth it. And that the NDP should have taken a stronger, more definitive, more assertive stance. And so it'll be interesting to see, I think that, with these by-elections looming, we could see Carney with the majority government regardless, in which case the influence of the NDP is less. The impact is more negligible. Is more negligible a redundant? I think it's a redundant phrase. But that'll put him in a tougher spot. But he's got to look at this as a longer game, because you're no longer in a position where you can pressure the feds to say, if you want your budget passed, you got to give us this and this and this. If the Liberals do well in the by-elections, or even in just two of them, then they're not going to need to worry about it. But Avi Lewis is going to have to do something to start rebuilding that party. And it was interesting to see the comments that people left on our posts when we talked to Supriya about it, and that interesting dynamic that the new federal NDP leader has, in particular with two NDP opposition leaders in Alberta and Saskatchewan. He's starting it off on a really strange foot. Like, wouldn't you... Here's the thing I don't understand. And we'll ask Naheed Nenshi about this. We're hoping, I'll put his team on the clock here. We're hoping to have Nenshi with us on Thursday morning. I don't know if it's going to work yet, but we're asking for it. And I want to ask him this about the name change and everything else. Now, there's not one looming, but if the Alberta NDP and the federal NDP are truly so far apart to the point where Naheed Nenshi's first response and immediate response to Avi Lewis winning the federal leadership is to come out and rip him, which is what he did. And we talked about it with Supriya. If you really want to dig into it, we had a great conversation with her. First episode of Every Week, presented by Mercedes-Benz Edmonton West. We get into this, but it's like, if you're that far apart ideologically and otherwise, or even if you just can't stand each other for whatever the case may be, why would the Alberta NDP continue to stick with that name when all it does is nail their feet to the floor? Now, I know that other people may argue, well, like, what is it? A leopard can't change its spots, or regardless of how you rebrand it or what you name it, it's still just going to be the NDP.
You can't paint lipstick on a pig and tell me it's
But if you look at it, like, people objectively, I know that, there will be a lot of conversations about Rachel Notley and her legacy, and a lot of people just have, you talk about Trump derangement. I mean, there is a Notley derangement that is very real, and the residual impact of it is wild. Like, she hasn't been premier for 7 years. But people will widely acknowledge that compared to other NDP premiers or opposition leaders, anybody else in the provincial NDP across the country, Rachel Notley governed most like a conservative. I remember when I was doing terrestrial talk radio, we'd get this recurring text all the time. People would say, it's such a shame that Rachel Notley couldn't be the leader of the progressive conservatives because it'd be a really nice fit there. But if you look at like the legacy of NDP governance in Alberta, it is not the same. It's not even remotely the same as what Avi Lewis is talking about, right? About like, all public services and leaving all the oil in the ground and shutting down the oil sands and that kind of a thing. It's not even close. And you look at Naheed Nenshi, or for that matter, Carla Beck, the NDP opposition leader in Saskatchewan, what was their first messaging? Like their very first messaging in responding to the Avi Lewis leadership win over the weekend in Winnipeg was to talk about the importance of the energy sector, oil and gas, pipelines, and the like. What is the reason that the Alberta NDP would continue to roll with that name? If that name is the number one thing that's standing in its way of making progress with voters, right? Like Danielle Smith pounced on this, and I don't blame her. Like from a strategic standpoint, politically, it makes perfect sense. It's a no-brainer for her when Avi Lewis wins. I mean, like she's got to be like rubbing her hands together, like gleefully. This is like almost like a Mr. Burns type situation where you're like, oh my gosh, we have the new federal NDP leader, right? Talking about basically nailing Alberta's feet to the floor and hampering its economy and shutting down its cash cow, its golden goose. And now, because public perception is that, and on the technicality, this has changed, but public perception is that membership in the provincial party equals membership in the federal party. Why wouldn't you draw a direct line between Avi Lewis and Naheed Nenshi if you're Danielle Smith? I mean, this is a gift for the UCP. So what's Nenshi going to do about it? I don't know. I hope to ask him a couple of episodes from now.
What's that line from the Sandler movie? He's losing his mind, and I'm reaping all the benefits. That's exactly what I thought when it happened. I'm like, it's so weird how it just plays into both hands and doesn't play into both hands too with Avi being elected. But we'll have to see what actually happens there. But yeah, the stark contrast in the clips yesterday. I mean, I don't even know if we should replay them, but it was just crazy that Avi got up on TV, on national television, and said, I can't wait until Nenshi's premiere. I am behind him 100%. Oh, yeah. And then you flip to Nenshi's comment, and it's like, demerit for Avi. I don't even know if I like the guy personally.
Yeah, well, why don't I, what I can do, John, is on short notice, I can play it from my screen here because our shorts and our highlights are conveniently presented on the Real Talk YouTube channel. Thanks to everybody that subscribes. It's free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then you can show your support from there at different levels if you'd like. The Danielle Smith Golden Cat thumbnail is very well done. Yeah. Very well done. Look at that. But here it is. Prairie Progressives split over Avi Lewis.
I want Naheed Nenshi to be the next premier of Alberta. We must get rid of Danielle Smith. And Naheed Nenshi has stood up for trans kids and stood up for workers against the unreasonable use of the notwithstanding clause. And I'm utterly devoted to Naheed's victory.
So Nenshi tweets, today the federal New Democrats selected its new leader. He says it's clear that the direction of the federal party under this new leader, someone who openly cheered for the defeat of the Alberta NDP government, is not in the interests of Alberta. Who loves this more, Danielle Smith or Wab Kinew? They both appear to love it.
For very different reasons. If you look at what David Eby had to say, premier out in British Columbia, and Wab Kinew, of course, premier of Manitoba, Eby was much more measured in his comments, and Wab Kinew straight up saying that he loved Avi, right?
I just love Avi. He's just a great person, and we don't have to agree on everything in order to do the big things together.
Let's take a look at what Carla Beck released as well. She's not the premier of Saskatchewan. She wants to be, though, the Saskatchewan NDP leader. She says the positions you've taken when it comes to natural resource development are ideological and unrealistic. They would hurt Saskatchewan workers, communities, and industries.
If I was going to put a divide on it, and if I was doing, helping out the NDP with their spin, I would say very clearly that this says something about people who can actually win elections and how they conduct themselves, and those who have yet to really prove themselves in a winning manner maybe feel a little bit more defensive and have to kind of come out swinging a little bit more.
That's Supriya Dwivedi in our March 30th episode. So yeah, interesting. It's pretty, it's understandable. Alberta and Saskatchewan typically see eye to eye.
Buddies.
On a lot.
Drinking buddies.
Manitoba can march to the beat of its own drum. And, Manitoba had a conservative premier not too long ago, right? So it'd be interesting to see how that goes. But as always, and of course, we know that there's Real Talkers that check out the show from across the country. The majority of you are in Western Canada, but not all of you. If we're talking about something, it could be Churchill, it could be Energy East. It could be, obviously talk about some of the activity, energy implications that are happening in Newfoundland in particular. If you're listening to us from the West Coast and you have a dramatically different take or an interpretation of an interview that you're not necessarily hearing reflected on the show, and I think our live chat does an amazing job of reflecting the spectrum of public opinion, but we encourage you to get in touch with us to talk at ryanjesperson.com. Of course, we always invite you to check out our live stream presented by California Closets across 7 different platforms, including YouTube, the Mixler audio app. We're live on LinkedIn every single morning. A big shout out to those folks, John, that show up to the office and the very first thing they do when they get to their cubicle is to load up Real Talk on LinkedIn. We love you guys.
I'm going to chase these leads. I'm going to look for a new job. But I'm going to listen to Real Talk while I do it.
I love that. We always hope to make your day a little bit brighter, make your life a little bit better. As we wrap this episode with our thanks for your support, subscribing through our YouTube channel, liking and sharing our content, telling your friends about what you heard on the show. We want to let you know what's coming up over the next couple of days. Sharon Carr will join us on April 1st. We'll get into the top stories making news. We'll talk digital risk advisory with our friends from North Road Investment Council. Coming up on Thursday, we hope to speak with Naheed Nenshi. We'll talk supervised consumption as well. And then we're off for Good Friday, back next Monday with Supriya. We'll see you tomorrow.
Real Talk is hosted by Ryan Jesperson, executive producer Josh Dunford, technical producer John Hicks, general manager Katie Cook-Chivers, account coordinator Lawrence Derlego, human resources Lena Shepard, website design Mike Johnston, voiceover by me, Carrie Skelton, member emerita Julie Rohr. Real Talk is recorded in Edmonton, Alberta on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional and ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux, home to the Métis settlements and the Métis Nation of Alberta. Real Talk is a relay project. For more, check out ryanjesperson.com.